Morning everybody. It's time for a Sunday morning thought for the day. I didn't do one last week because I wasn't speaking, but I am going to try and do one. I've had requests to try and carry on doing them. So this is actually the homily from the Zoom service. So if you are at the Zoom service, then this is exactly what I said, more or less. So yeah, it was lovely to have so many people at the Zoom service this morning. If you couldn't make it, then this is what I was talking about and about today, which is the Sunday after Ascension Day. Oh, interesting. We're going to talk about that a bit. The reading that I'm going to mainly be talking about is from Acts chapter 1, and I was going to focus on verses 12 through to 14. So this is that little bit of Acts chapter 1, 12 to 14. Then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath's day walk from the city. When they arrived, they went upstairs to the room where they were staying. Those present were Peter, John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus and Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James. They all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. So that's the very end of the reading. Jesus had just ascended. He'd just disappeared from their sight again. So in 2016, the Archbishops of Canterbury and York at that time initiated the first of Thy Kingdom Come campaigns, partly inspired by this reading in Acts. They wanted to encourage people to pray for 10 minutes a day from Ascension Day to Pentecost, remembering this passage between Ascension and Pentecost where the people, Jesus' followers, were praying. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and there are some clear characteristics of both of those books, and one of them is to do with Luke talking about the women. We're going to think about this, we are thinking about this a bit during the midweek thoughts for the day. You can go back to Wednesday and see what I said about Miriam and how the little children's storybook of Moses in the bulrushes should really be called Miriam's Great Adventure or Miriam's Bravest Deed. So Luke is a bit more like the Andy Murray of his day amongst the gospel writers. Do you remember Andy corrected a journalist in a press conference once in 2017 where Andy said that that's just completely wrong. The question you've asked me is completely wrong because that's true in the women's Torah or something like that. You can Google it. Andy Murray stands up to sexist journalist 2017. See how he responded to that. Andy's always standing up for the women's Torah in those situations. So Luke is a bit like the Andy Murray of the disciples, and he includes not only the men, although he does name all the men, but he also remarks that the women are there too, including Mary, and also intriguingly talks about Jesus's brothers. So the women are there, Mary's there as well. And they were constantly in prayer. They were praying and praying and praying, and they were waiting and waiting and waiting. So prayer is about communication with God. And communication is a challenge for us at the moment. There are news articles about how paper letter writing is undergoing a resurgence at the moment. And certainly we have received some lovely letters in our household over the past few weeks and some postcards from people. And some have left our house as well. In fact, yesterday I was going through a box of old things looking for something else, and I found some letters from 20 years ago, and actually reading them reminded me of the love that was shared in those letters. So that was lovely. So letter writing is back in fashion as a way of communicating with people. But when we can't meet together as church congregations, it really is a challenge about how we communicate with each other. How do we want to communicate with each other? How do we want people to communicate with us? And there's all these different options now. We could phone them, we could WhatsApp them, we could text them, we could email them, we could use Facebook, we could use Microsoft Teams. In fact, in our house, the little Microsoft Teams noise, the little Microsoft Teams calling noise, has become one of those things which we hear with regularity. We could use Zoom. We could send a postcard or receive a postcard. Some of us, we might deliver food to someone. I've been dropping some treats into a couple of people. We could write an old-fashioned paper letter. There's a legend about the American Civil War, and I was talking about this in the Zoom service. I was thinking about the legend, which I read a lovely definition of legend. Legend is truth's elder sister. Truth's beautiful elder sister is legend. Anyway, so it goes that, remember the one about the washing line where they'd hung up, this order of shirts and petticoats was communicating to the American rebels what the British were up to. How true that is, I don't know. But there are lots and lots of different ways of communicating to people today. And now we find ourselves in a position which reminds us of the position that the disciples were in whilst they were waiting, praying and waiting and waiting and praying. We've all been told to wait, and we don't really know how long for, and we don't know what the end of the waiting will look like. And that's similar to the disciples waiting and praying. I always feel real sympathy for the disciples at this time. The Ascension brings them a second grief, a second loss, a second disorientation when they are already completely disorientated anyway. And we find ourselves disorientated. We are in unprecedented times, uncharted waters. We are completely disorientated. The world is similar but different. That is possibly the most disorientating place to be. And so we also wait and pray. That's what we do. And we pray how we can, however that is for us. God doesn't really mind how we communicate with him as long as we do. When I was first the school governor in Somerset in 2004, which seems eons ago, we had lots and lots of discussions about speaking and listening, because it was a real struggle for some of our early years pupils who came into the school. The speaking and listening was not in place for all of them. And we used a thing called Somerset Total Communication, which was very similar to Makaton. And particularly in the first school where I was governor, we found it really helped the children to communicate, to understand, to think about how that communication was working for them. So we should pray. We should pray, and we should communicate with God and listen to him communicating with us. It may be that we talk to him out loud and we listen and we kind of hear him talking to us. That might be how it works for us. It might be that does that. And it might be that happens in the most unlikely of places, like when you're waiting for the kettle to boil for a cup of tea, or when you're digging the garden, or some people find writing really helps. Some people write a prayer journal. You could write letters to God, listening to what he's saying as you write and waiting for him to respond. You could go for a walk with the intent of praying. If you even put your headphones in and talk out loud, people would just assume you're on the phone. You could do that. You could go out, you could walk, you could listen to God. Or you could use some sort of signing. How would you think about signing your prayers to God? Some people have their hands open on their laps as they pray, or some people put their hands together. Some people make other signs. How would you sign to God, and how would God sign to you? Whatever it is, God understands. God can communicate with us in all sorts of different ways, and that is praying. Whatever it is this week, as we wait for Pentecost, and we wait for our personal circumstances to change, and we wait for our world circumstances to change, we don't know what the plan is. We don't know what's going to happen. Like the disciples, we need to pray. Let's be like those disciples, praying and waiting and waiting and praying in whatever way best we can speak to God, and whatever way best we can listen to Him. That's today's thought for the day. And next week it will be Pentecost Sunday. I might be brave enough to go and try, and I might even be able to manage to find my orange banners, so we'll see what I manage to do with my untidy bookcases in celebration of Pentecost. So I'll see you all soon. There'll be a midweek thought for the day, probably 10:30 Wednesday morning, and at some point I'm going to do some Playmobil people story this week as well, even though it's school holiday. I might try and do that Thursday at 3 in the kind of usual slot. So I'll see you all soon. Okay, bye.